The glass towers of Dallas rose around me like crystalline guardians, their reflective surfaces throwing back the harsh Texas sun in fragments of azure and gold. These were my walls, my fortress against the chaos that lurked beyond the city limits. Nature, that ancient enemy of civilization, had been successfully contained behind concrete and steel, reduced to carefully manicured parks and potted plants in corporate lobbies. I had grown comfortable in this artificial ecosystem. When my childhood friends spoke of camping trips and outdoor adventures, I viewed their enthusiasm with the same bemused detachment one might reserve for religious zealots. The very concept seemed like willing regression. Why abandon centuries of human progress to sleep on dirt and battle insects? My mother's tales of childhood camping trips read like cautionary fables. She spoke of midnight storms that turned tent floors into shallow ponds, of raccoons that moved with almost human intelligence to raid food supplies, of the suffocating darkness that descended when clouds obscured the moon. These stories confirmed my urban prejudices. Nature was something to be viewed through windows, not experienced firsthand. Every summer I watched my friends' families load their vehicles with what seemed like mobile settlements, tents, coolers, sleeping bags, and mysterious equipment whose purpose I could only guess at. They would return days later, sunburned and bug-bitten, speaking in reverent tones about experiences I had no desire to share. I took comfort in air conditioning and pest control, thankful that my parents preferred resort pools to lake shores. The irony of what I would become haunts me still. In my darkest moments, when sleep proves elusive and the memory of gunshots echoes through my mind, I wonder if my transformation had been inevitable. Some dormant genetic code activating like a time bomb, turning the city boy into a creature of the wild. But that's getting ahead of myself. To understand my fall from grace, you must first understand my ascension to paradise. Bruce Hall at the University of North Texas became the unlikely cathedral of my conversion. The dormitory itself was unremarkable, institutional architecture at its most utilitarian, all straight lines and easy clean surfaces. But my assigned roommate, Tyler Matthews, brought with him something that would change my life forever. He arrived bearing the scent of the deep woods, an aroma that no amount of artificial freshener could mask. Pine sap, wood smoke, loamy soil, and something deeper, something that spoke of dawn mist and ancient things. His clothes, though clean, held the memory of countless campfires. He had grown up in the dense forests around Nacogdoches, where the pine canopy grew so thick it created permanent twilight, where silence held meaning I couldn't yet comprehend. "City folk," he would say, watching me conduct my daily inspection for spiders, "y'all spend so much time fighting nature you forget how to live with it." At first, I dismissed him as another backcountry philosopher, spouting woodland wisdom to mask a simple world view. But then I saw his photographs. The images that plastered his wall defied my urban understanding. Vistas stretched to impossible horizons, colors that made my concrete world seem monochrome in comparison. His friends would gather in our room planning weekend expeditions with the fervor of medieval crusaders plotting holy wars. Their conversations were peppered with terms that might as well have been ancient Greek. Trail names, gear weights, leave no trace principles. They spoke of places I'd only seen on maps as if they were old friends, beloved but temperamental. The invitation came during a particularly bitter February. Dallas lay under a sheet of freezing rain, the streets empty save for the occasional foolhardy driver sliding between buildings. The prospect of spring break spent dodging ice storms held little appeal. When Tyler casually mentioned they had room for one more at Lake Ray Roberts, something shifted inside me, a tectonic movement of the soul. "You'll need gear," Tyler said, eyeing my pristine Nike sneakers and North Face backpack with barely concealed disdain. What followed was a week-long crash course in wilderness survival that shook the foundations of my urban existence. I learned that cotton, the fabric of city life, became a death sentence in the wild, holding moisture against the skin until hypothermia set in. Synthetic materials and wool became my new armor. Tyler taught me the hierarchy of survival needs: shelter, water, fire, food. Each element required its own expertise, its own specialized equipment. But most importantly, he introduced me to DEET, that magical chemical shield against the hordes of mosquitoes that had plagued my childhood ventures beyond city limits. That first trip to Lake Ray Roberts marked my rebirth. Without the constant warfare against insects, I could finally see the world they inhabited. The lake stretched before us like liquid mercury in the dawn light, its surface broken by the occasional leap of largemouth bass. Tyler showed me how to read the water, how subtle ripples betrayed the presence of fish below, how different species preferred different depths and structures. When I landed my first fish, the surge of primitive triumph that coursed through my veins felt like awakening from a lifetime of slumber. The bass wasn't large by any standard, but as it thrashed in my hands, scales glinting in the morning sun, I felt connected to something ancient and profound. This wasn't the sanitized nature of city parks. This was raw, vital, alive. I threw myself into this new world with the zeal of a convert. Every free moment was spent studying field guides, learning to identify trees by their bark patterns, birds by their calls, animals by their tracks. The small patches of wilderness around Denton became my classroom. I learned that nature wasn't chaos. It was a language, ancient and precise, written in broken twigs and displaced pebbles. My transformation bewildered my Dallas friends. Their texts became less frequent. Their invitations to clubs and bars declined with increasing politeness. I hardly noticed. The forest had become my sanctuary, each trip a pilgrimage to something larger than myself. When I wasn't in the woods, I was planning my next excursion, mapping routes through increasingly remote areas. I should have recognized the warning signs. The way Tyler and his friends began to drift away, their eyes clouding with concern when I spoke of my solo trips. They had grown up with respect for the wilderness, not just for its beauty but for its dangers. I had skipped that lesson, drunk on the intoxicating freedom of the wild. The National Forest in East Texas called to me like a siren song. I won't name it here. Names have power, and this place holds enough darkness without my words adding weight to its shadow. I had read the warnings on forums and blogs, dismissed them as the usual paranoid ramblings of the internet. Overzealous hunters, they said. Stay away during season. Wear orange. Use common sense. Basic precautions for a world I thought I understood. The 3-hour drive passed in a blur of anticipation, my Jeep loaded with gear that would have been alien to my former self. The forest welcomed me with the soft whisper of pine needles, the air heavy with the scent of resin and decay. I set up camp with practiced efficiency, my tent a small island of civilization in an ocean of green. The feeling of being watched crept in slowly, like evening shadows lengthening across the forest floor. At first I dismissed it as the natural wariness of animals observing an intruder. But there was something wrong about the quality of the silence that followed me, not the respectful hush that accompanies human passage through the woods, but something deeper, more deliberate. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The next morning dawned with deceptive beauty. Mist clung to the trees like gossamer, transforming the forest into something from a fairy tale. I packed my day bag with the confidence of experience. First aid kit, compass, water purifier, emergency shelter. The weight of the pack against my shoulders felt like armor. The first few hours of hiking passed without incident, the trail winding through stands of loblolly pine and sweet gum. It wasn't until I stopped for coffee that the illusion of solitude shattered. The flash of movement caught in my peripheral vision might have been anything: a deer, a bird, a trick of light through leaves. But the crow's call that followed carried a note of warning that made my skin crawl. The smell reached me first, a chemical tang that had no place in these woods. It cut through the natural aromas of humus and pine, artificial and wrong. My mind, still clouded by years of urban living, didn't immediately recognize the danger. Instead, curiosity drew me forward, each step carrying me deeper into territory I had no business entering. The first shot kicked up pine needles near my feet. The crack of the rifle came a heartbeat later, the sound bouncing between the trees until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I dropped to the ground as training videos watched years ago kicked in, but this was no hunting accident. The second shot came deliberately close, a warning or poor aim, I couldn't tell which. What followed was a nightmare of crashing through undergrowth, lungs burning, branches whipping at my face. The forest that had become my meditation turned hostile, every root and vine seeming to reach for my feet. More shots rang out, but I couldn't tell if they were aimed at me or meant to herd me in a particular direction. The chemical smell grew stronger as I ran, and understanding finally dawned. This was no overzealous hunter, no territorial landowner. I had stumbled into something darker, a corruption of the natural world I had come to love. The cartel's growing operations were no urban legend, no cautionary tale told around campfires. They were a cancer in the heart of these woods, defended by men who viewed human life as cheaply as the plants they tended. I ran until my legs gave out, then walked until I reached my camp. Everything was packed in record time, my usual leave-no-trace principles abandoned in blind panic. The guilt of leaving a smoldering fire pit gnawed at me all the way to the local police station, where I filed a report that felt inadequate even as I spoke the words. The officer's lack of surprise told its own story. How many other reports had he taken? How many other hikers had stumbled into territory marked by invisible boundaries, protected by very visible guns? The forest held darker secrets than I had imagined, and my paradise had been irreversibly poisoned by this knowledge. Later, browsing through hiking forums, I found a post that resonated with sickening familiarity. Another hiker, another close encounter, another story of gunfire and fear. The details aligned too perfectly with my experience to be coincidence. The forest harbored secrets, and those secrets were protected with lethal force. 9 years have passed since that day. I still live near enough to the woods to hear the whisper of wind through leaves on quiet nights. Sometimes I catch myself staring into the tree line, feeling the pull of that other world I once inhabited. But I can't go back. Not because of fear, though that lingered long enough, but because of understanding. The wilderness I fell in love with was a myth, a story we tell ourselves about pristine nature untouched by human darkness. The reality is more complex, more dangerous. Every trail potentially leads to someone's secret. Every clearing could hide someone's crime. The forest remains beautiful, but it's the beauty of a poison thing, lovely and deadly. I pass my knowledge on to others now. The practical skills, the identification guides, the leave-no-trace principles. But I also teach them what I learned too late, that the greatest dangers in the wilderness wear human faces, that paradise can be lost not to snakes or spiders or bears, but to the poison we bring with us into Eden. The woods still call to me, their voice carried on the wind that rattles my windows on stormy nights. But I've learned to be content with memories of what was, rather than risk finding what is. I remember the forest as it first appeared to me, crisp, clean, beautiful. I choose to keep it that way, preserved in amber like a perfect specimen, untouched by the darkness I know lurks beneath its canopy. In my dreams, I still walk those paths, still feel the warmth of morning sun filtering through pine boughs. But even in dreams, the chemical smell lingers, and the crack of rifles echoes through the trees. Paradise once lost can never truly be regained. The knowledge of corruption, like the fruit of Eden's tree, cannot be unknown. Sometimes, in the deepest part of night, I wonder if my urban self had been right all along. If our ancestors built walls not to keep nature out, but to keep ourselves safe from the darkness that dwells within it. Not the darkness of wild things, but of human things, of secrets buried in deep woods and protected by lead and blood. The city towers still rise around me, their glass surfaces reflecting the sun. But now they feel less like a fortress and more like a reminder that no matter how far we try to separate ourselves from nature, we carry its darkest aspects within us. The real beasts were never the mosquitoes or spiders I once feared, but the men who turned paradise into hunting grounds. And so I remain in my concrete forest, where the dangers at least wear familiar faces. The wild places call to me still, but I have learned to resist their siren song. Some paradises once lost are better left as memories. The quarantine had felt like being buried alive. Our apartment walls had become both sanctuary and prison, the days bleeding into one another until time lost all meaning. When the restrictions finally lifted, Mandy and I didn't just want to go hiking. We needed to. The state park had been our sanctuary since before our marriage, its trails holding memories of easier times. I remember how Mandy's eyes lit up as we packed our gear. She held each item like a talisman, her favorite moisture-wicking shirt, the titanium spork I'd given her as a joke wedding present, the ultralight tent we'd saved for months to buy. The familiar ritual of preparation felt like waking from a long nightmare. The morning we set out was perfect, the kind of clear, warm day that makes you believe in divine intervention. The trail stretched before us like an invitation, soft spring sunlight filtering through new leaves. After months of recycled air and artificial light, the forest smells hit me like a drug. Decomposing leaves, fresh earth, pine sap warming in the sun. "We're the only ones here," Mandy said, her voice carrying a note of wonder. The parking lot had been empty save for our car, and we hadn't seen another soul on the trail. The solitude felt appropriate after so much forced isolation, like we were the last two people on Earth. Looking back, I wish we had been. The campsite where we stopped for lunch was one of those standard state park setups. Concrete picnic table, metal fire ring, probably installed in the 70s and barely maintained since. We spotted the other couple before they saw us. They looked like they'd stepped out of an REI catalog, matching technical gear, color-coordinated backpacks, the kind of expensive boots that never seem to get dirty. "Mind if we join you?" I called out, following trail etiquette. The man, Jason, we'd later learn, waved us over with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. His wife Sarah was arranging their lunch with precise movements that reminded me of someone setting up a photo shoot. "We're on our honeymoon," Sarah announced before we'd even sat down. There was something performative about the way she said it, like an actress who'd rehearsed her lines too many times. But Mandy, ever the romantic, latched onto this detail like a lifeline. "Oh my God, that's so wonderful," she gushed. And I settled in for what I knew would be at least an hour of wedding talk. I studied the couple as the women chatted. Something about them felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way Jason kept glancing at the trail behind us, or how Sarah's smile never quite reached her eyes. 2 hours passed like water through cupped hands, each moment sliding away before I could properly grasp it. Looking back now, I try to catalog every detail, every expression that might have warned us. The way Jason's hand would twitch toward his wife whenever she spoke too long. How Sarah's laugh seemed to catch in her throat, like something was blocking its natural flow. "We're heading to Sunset Point," Jason said, his voice casual but his eyes intense. "Sarah's never seen the view from up there." I felt Mandy stiffen beside me, barely perceptible, but after years of marriage I knew her tells. She'd caught something in his tone that I'd missed. Sarah's face had gone still, like a pond freezing over. "Be careful up there," I found myself saying. "The paths can be treacherous even in good weather." Sarah's eyes met mine for a moment, and I saw something there that would haunt my dreams for months to come. A desperate plea wrapped in resignation, like someone watching a door close on their last chance of escape. We reached the lake as the sun was beginning its descent, painting the water in shades of amber and blood. Mandy worked on dinner while I set up camp, our practiced routine a dance we'd performed countless times. But something felt wrong, off rhythm, like music played slightly out of tune. "Did Sarah seem okay to you?" Mandy asked as we sat by the fire. The flames cast shifting shadows across her face, making her expression hard to read. "What do you mean?" "I don't know." She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spinning into the darkening sky. She kept touching her wedding ring like it was burning her. "And did you notice how she never said his name?" "Not once in 2 hours of conversation." I hadn't noticed, but that was Mandy. She saw the details I missed, read the subtle languages of body and breath that I was blind to. It's what made her such a good nurse, this ability to spot the symptoms before they became obvious. The night wrapped around us like a shroud, and somewhere in the distance we heard a scream. Probably just a fox, but it sounded human enough to send chills down my spine. Dawn broke gray and threatening, the perfect weather for what was to come. We packed up camp with efficiency born of experience, but every rustle in the undergrowth made me pause, every snapping twig drew my eye. Nature's normal morning sounds seemed loaded with menace. The trail felt different on the return journey, darker despite the daylight, the trees pressing closer, their branches reaching like grasping hands. When we encountered Jason, alone and wild-eyed, it felt like meeting a character from a horror movie we'd been unwittingly cast in. "She got sick," Jason said, the words tumbling out before we'd even asked. "Went home early." His eyes darted between us like trapped animals, never settling, never meeting our gaze. His clothes were the same as yesterday, but something was different. A dark stain on his sleeve that could have been mud, scratches on his hands that hadn't been there during lunch. "Oh no," Mandy said, her nurse's voice sliding into place. "What kind of sick?" Jason's answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. "Stomach thing. You know how it is. She insisted I finish the trip." He laughed, but the sound was wrong, hollow like wind through a dead tree. A group approached on the trail, their chatter carrying through the trees. Jason's head snapped toward the sound with predatory alertness. "I should catch up with them," he said, already backing away. "Get some hiking buddies." We watched him go, his pack swaying oddly as he walked, like it was lighter than it should have been. The news report hit me like a physical blow. Sarah's face filled our TV screen, not the carefully composed woman from the trail, but a younger version, beaming in her wedding photo. The contrast between that joy and what we knew now felt obscene. "Tragic accident at Sunset Point," the reporter said, her voice professionally somber. "The victim's husband reports she lost her footing while watching the sunrise." Mandy's hand found mine, squeezing until it hurt. We both knew the official story was wrong, the timeline didn't match, the lies didn't align. But what did we really know? What could we prove? The police station smelled of coffee and bureaucracy. The deputy took our statement with mechanical efficiency, his pen scratching across the paper like an insect building its nest. We told him everything: the lunch, the encounter, the lies about illness. "We'll look into it," he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. What did we have, really? A man acting strange after his wife's death? Inconsistent stories told in moments of grief? Walking out, I caught a glimpse of our reflection in the station window. Two people who had wandered off the marked trail of normal life and found themselves in darker territory. A year has passed. The case is closed, marked as an accident, filed away in whatever drawer holds uncomfortable truths. But we can't let it go. Every hike now carries the weight of that memory. Every friendly couple we meet on the trail becomes a potential predator and prey. The woods that once offered escape now feel like an accomplice to murder. I find myself obsessively checking news reports, searching for patterns, other accidents, other grieving husbands, other stories that don't quite add up. Mandy says she dreams of Sarah sometimes. In the dreams, they're back at that picnic table. But Sarah's trying to tell her something in a language made of blinks and broken breaths. She always wakes up before she understands the message. The truth lives in the spaces between what we know and what we can prove. Jason walks free, perhaps planning his next honeymoon. Sarah's body lies in consecrated ground, her death marked as tragic but natural. But we know different. We carry the weight of that knowledge like stones in our pockets. Should we push harder, risk being labeled as cranks, conspiracy theorists? Or do we accept that sometimes evil wins, that some predators wear wedding rings and shop at REI, that justice is more fragile than we want to believe? When I close my eyes at night, I see Sarah's face across that picnic table, the careful smile, the pleading eyes. I hear Jason's hollow laugh echoing through the trees. I feel the weight of choices not made, help not given, warnings not understood until too late. The woods hold secrets well, too well, but they also remember. And somewhere on that trail, between the lies and truth, between civilization and wilderness, a woman's last moments play out endlessly, waiting for someone to finally understand what really happened. Until then, we carry her story. We tell it here, hoping that someone, maybe you, will see what we saw, feel what we felt, understand what we understood too late. Because somewhere out there, Jason is probably hiking another trail, meeting another couple, planning another perfect accident. And the woods watch, silent and complicit as they always have. To those who find solace in the wilderness, who seek escape on lonely trails, remember that not all predators walk on four legs. Some wear wedding rings and carry expensive backpacks. Some plan their hunts years in advance. Watch for the signs we missed, the smiles that don't reach eyes, the touches that contain more control than affection, the stories that don't quite align. Trust your instincts when they whisper that something is wrong. And if you meet a friendly couple on the trail and something feels off, maybe don't stop for lunch. We didn't save Sarah, but maybe by telling this story, we can save someone else. Summer of 2015 started like any other season in the migrant workers' circuit, following the ripening fruit northward, chasing wages in the endless cycle of harvest. I'd fallen in with two others that season, a pair I jokingly called Ben and Jerry. Ben was the quiet one, all lean muscle and watchful eyes, carrying himself like someone who'd seen too much. Jerry was his opposite, quick with a joke but hiding something haunted behind his smile. We'd been working the cherry orchards for weeks, our fingers stained purple-red, backs aching from reaching into the canopies. The work was honest but brutal. 10-hour days under the baking sun, ladders digging into soft earth, the constant worry about splitting the fruit. By August, we were running on fumes, moving between orchards in Ben's rattling pickup truck. That's how we found the forest. It wasn't on any of our maps. We'd been following logging roads, trying to cut across to the next orchard when the sun started sinking. The GPS had lost signal hours ago, and the paper map showed nothing but green spaces between the highways. Ben was driving, Jerry was dozing, and I was watching the shadows lengthen between the trees when we passed the first warning sign. It wasn't like a normal Forest Service marker. This one was old, the wood weathered to gray, carved with symbols that seemed to shift when you looked at them directly. I asked Ben to slow down, but by the time we turned around to check it, we couldn't find it again. That should have been our first warning. The forest closed in around us as we drove deeper, the trees pressing closer to the road. These weren't the managed pines of logging country. These were old-growth giants, their trunks wider than our truck, their canopies blocking out most of the fading light. The air changed too, becoming thicker, carrying scents that didn't belong in a Pacific Northwest forest. Hints of incense, wet stone, and something metallic that caught in the back of the throat. We found the clearing just as the last light was fading. It opened up suddenly, as if the forest had exhaled, creating a perfect circle of open ground beside a creek that seemed to appear from nowhere. The water ran black in the twilight, moving too slowly for the sound it made. "This'll do," Ben said, killing the engine. None of us mentioned how the clearing seemed to be waiting for us, or how the surrounding trees had grown in such a perfect circle, their branches weaving together overhead to create what looked like a natural dome. Jerry and Ben set up their tents while I laid out my sleeping bag. They both offered to share their space, but something in me needed to sleep under the open sky that night. Looking back, I wonder if that was my own choice or if something was already influencing my decisions. The moonlight came on strong as we set up camp, casting everything in an unnatural silver that made shadows move wrong. We built a fire by the creek, its flames burning a shade too blue, the smoke curling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The wine we shared tasted different too, earthier, ancient somehow, as if the very air was changing what it touched. The oddities crept in slowly at first, small things that were easy to dismiss. The complete absence of insects, even near the water. The way sound seemed to stop at the clearing's edge. How the moonlight pooled in certain spots, avoiding others entirely. The rhythmic tapping from the woods that almost sounded like code. The shapes that seemed to move between the trees, always just at the edge of vision. We talked about normal things, work plans, future harvests, which orchards paid best. But underneath ran a current of unease, a growing awareness that we were somewhere we shouldn't be. Jerry's jokes became fewer and forced. Ben kept glancing into the darkness. I found myself speaking in whispers without knowing why. The fire died faster than it should have, the flames sinking into the earth as if pulled down. That's when we noticed the first real sign that something was wrong. The rocks around our fire pit had rearranged themselves while we weren't looking, forming a perfect spiral pattern that none of us had made. After the fire died, we should have gone to sleep immediately. Instead, we lingered in the clearing, as if something was keeping us awake. The moonlight had grown stronger, taking on an almost physical presence. It pooled in the center of our camp like silver water, making everything it touched look slightly wrong, too sharp, too real, like objects in a fever dream. The first sounds came around midnight. I was lying in my sleeping bag, watching the moonlight paint patterns through the canopy when I heard it. Footsteps on the creek's rocky bank. But wrong somehow. Each step seemed to carry too much weight, the rocks grinding together underneath in ways that spoke of impossible mass. The sound moved with deliberate purpose, getting closer to our camp with each passing moment. My first thought was bear, but bears don't walk with such rhythmic precision. Each step came exactly 3 seconds after the last, like something counting its way toward us. The sound suggested something massive, yet the rocks weren't just shifting under its weight. They were being pushed deep into the earth, the grinding noise carrying through the ground into my bones. The footsteps reached the edge of the creek, and I realized with growing horror that I'd left our food out, scattered around the dead fire. But that fear was quickly replaced by something deeper as the steps changed texture, moving from rock to soil, entering the clearing proper. The movement was heading directly toward where I lay. The moonlight remained bright enough to read by, bright enough to see any approaching creature. Yet the path stood empty, even as the footsteps drew closer, heavy and deliberate, now just meters from my feet. The ground compressed with each invisible step, leaving prints in the soil that were too large, too deep, and shaped all wrong. Not animal, not human, but something that walked on far too many points of contact with the earth. My heart thundered in my chest as the steps came to a halt right beside my sleeping bag. The air grew dense and cold, carrying that metallic scent from earlier, now strong enough to taste. Though I could see nothing there, I felt a presence looming over me, so vast it seemed to bend the moonlight around it. The air rippled like heat waves rising from summer pavement, forming a vague outline that hurt my eyes to look at. A sound came then, not from where the footsteps had stopped, but from all around us, as if the forest itself was drawing in a breath. The temperature plummeted, frost forming on my sleeping bag despite the summer night. I felt something reach toward me, not a physical touch, but a probing of my mind, ancient and alien, sifting through my thoughts like someone riffling through papers. The pressure became unbearable. I scrambled up, abandoning my sleeping bag as I ran for Jerry's tent, screaming for him to let me in. My fingers fought with the zipper as panic overwhelmed me. Behind me I heard more footsteps, but these moved differently, as if whatever made them was now walking on the sides of trees, circling our camp vertically. Inside the tent, Jerry held me as I shook, both of us listening to the impossible sounds outside. The footsteps continued for hours, moving in patterns that defied physics, up trees, across empty air, directly through solid objects. Occasionally something would brush against the tent fabric, leaving trails of frost in precise geometric patterns. Ben never emerged from his tent, but in the morning he told us he'd seen something through his tent mesh, a shape that seemed to fold in on itself, wrapped in shadows that moved against the direction of the moonlight. He described eyes that looked ancient and alien, full of cold intelligence and something like amusement. The next year passed in a haze of questions and obsession. I researched local legends, indigenous histories, anything that might explain what we'd encountered. The symbols I'd glimpsed in the frost patterns appeared in ancient texts, associated with boundary guardians and threshold entities, beings that existed between worlds, protecting places where reality grew thin. Ben was the only one who'd listened to my theories. Jerry had blocked that night from his memory, claiming it was just a shared hallucination from bad wine and exhaustion. But Ben had seen something too, and when I suggested returning, he agreed immediately. The forest was harder to find the second time. Roads that should have led there ended in different places. Landmarks we remembered had shifted or vanished. When we finally found the turnoff, it was marked with that same weathered sign, but now the symbols were clearer, warnings in a language older than writing. The clearing had transformed. Where we'd camped now stood a massive boulder, marked with a symbol that seemed to burn into your retinas, not carved or painted, but somehow part of the stone structure, visible from any angle. The mark matched descriptions I'd found of ancient wards, used to designate places where the boundary between worlds had worn thin. Around us, the forest had rearranged itself. The trees now grew in concentric circles, their trunks twisted into complex geometric patterns that couldn't have formed naturally. Half-dome structures of woven branches dotted the spaces between trees, each containing carefully arranged bones and stones in spiral patterns. The creek had changed course to form perfect right angles, its water now moving in ways that defied gravity. Strung between the trees were complex webs of rope and wire, decorated with bones, stones, and fragments of metal that hummed at frequencies just below human hearing. Each decoration seemed placed with mathematical precision, creating patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The feeling of being observed was overwhelming. Eyes seemed to peer from every shadow, from spaces that shouldn't exist. The air grew thick with presence, multiple consciousnesses pressing against our minds like cold fingers. Whatever dwelled here, we were in its territory now, and it had brought friends. We found the golden silk bag hanging from a branch, bones poking through its fabric. when the wind moved it, though there was no wind. The bones clicked together in patterns that sounded almost like language. Below it, the ground was strewn with rose petals arranged in fractals, each petal placed with impossible precision. The forest was showing us something, not just evidence of supernatural presence, but hints of a vast and ancient system of power, a network of guardians and gates that had existed long before humans walked these woods. Every symbol, every arrangement spoke of boundaries and thresholds, of places where multiple realities overlapped. A week later, we returned with Wiz, a friend who practiced paganism and recognized the symbols from ancient protection rites. The forest had transformed again, but this time it felt deliberate, a display of power meant to communicate. The rock formations had shifted into new configurations that seemed to fold through extra dimensions, creating shapes that shouldn't be possible in three-dimensional space. The rose petals now covered everything, forming patterns that moved when you weren't looking directly at them. The air had thickened to soup, filled with dancing motes that might have been dust or might have been watching eyes. The half-dome structures had multiplied, now containing increasingly complex arrangements of bones, stones, and metals that hummed at different frequencies. We'd barely entered the clearing when the mosquitoes came. Not a natural swarm, but a solid wall of insects that moved with collective intelligence. They formed shapes in the air, symbols matching those on the rocks, three-dimensional glyphs that rotated and transformed. Through the swarm, we caught glimpses of something massive moving between the trees, its form constantly shifting, composed of shadows and negative space. The humming of the swarm formed words in languages that hadn't been spoken aloud in millennia. Wiz recognized fragments, phrases about guardians, about boundaries, about places where the old powers still held sway. The swarm was both message and messenger, a tool being used by something far older and stranger than mere insects. Through the swarm's shifting patterns, the truth began to emerge. This place wasn't just a random forest, it was a nexus, a crossing point between realities where ancient powers still held authority. The symbols matched those found in cultures across the world, all referring to the same thing: places where the membrane between worlds had worn thin, where entities older than humanity stood guard. The footsteps I'd heard that first night belonged to something that existed simultaneously in multiple realities, choosing which aspects of itself to reveal in our limited dimension. The symbols, the structures, the arranged bones, all were part of a vast symbolic language, a way for these entities to mark their territories and communicate with each other across the boundaries of space and time. What we encountered wasn't just a single entity, but part of an ancient network of guardians, beings that had walked the earth long before humans emerged, protecting places where reality itself grew thin and malleable. The symbols of protection weren't meant to guard against evil, they were warnings to humans, marking places where we weren't meant to go. The invisibility of our first night visitor wasn't deception but mercy. To see its true form would have shattered our understanding of reality. Even the glimpses we caught through the mosquito swarm were heavily filtered, our minds interpreting in familiar patterns what was fundamentally alien and incomprehensible. The experience changed us fundamentally. Jerry eventually left the state, unable to cope with memories he couldn't rationalize. Ben became obsessed with ancient languages and symbology, searching for more places marked by these entities. Wiz retreated into deeper occult studies, trying to understand the powers we'd glimpsed. As for me, I've come to understand that what we experienced was just the surface of something vast and ancient. The forest was a classroom of sorts where something old and powerful chose to reveal itself gradually, testing our capacity to comprehend its existence. The footsteps, the symbols, the transforming landscape, all were lessons in a language we're only beginning to understand. Sometimes on full moon nights I dream of that clearing. In these dreams I finally see the truth. that our reality is just one layer of many, and in the spaces between these layers walk beings that have guarded the boundaries since time began. They take forms we can almost comprehend: Sasquatch, Wendigo, forest spirits, but their true nature is far stranger and more profound. The symbols I saw in that forest have begun appearing in my daily life, in ancient texts, in modern films, in the patterns of shadows on city walls. They're everywhere once you know how to look, marking places where the old powers still hold sway. Sometimes I wonder if those powers are spreading, reclaiming territories lost to human development, preparing for something we can't yet understand. The footsteps I heard that night weren't a haunting or a monster. They were a greeting, an introduction to truths humanity has forgotten. The forest wasn't just a place, but a threshold where multiple realities converged, guarded by entities that have watched our species crawl out of the caves and build our civilizations, always keeping us away from knowledge we weren't ready to possess. Now, when I'm in the woods and hear unexpected sounds, I don't look too hard into the shadows. Some things aren't meant to be seen clearly. Some knowledge isn't meant to be fully grasped. But I know they're there, the ancient ones, the guardians, the watchers between worlds. And sometimes, if you're quiet and still, they might just choose to show you a glimpse of what really walks in the spaces between spaces, in the shadows between shadows, in the dreams between dreams. The truth isn't that we're alone in these ancient woods. It's that we were never alone at all. We're just not ready to comprehend our true company. Long before our ill-fated journey began, my best friend Zach and I had been planning this adventure for months. We were both experienced hikers, having tackled numerous challenging trails across the country. But the Appalachian Trail was different. A 190-mile behemoth stretching from Georgia to Maine, it represented the ultimate test of our outdoor skills and endurance. Our fascination with the trail began years ago when we were just kids growing up in a small town in Virginia. We'd spend hours poring over maps and trail guides, dreaming of the day we'd conquer the legendary path. As we grew older, our weekend hikes turned into longer backpacking trips, each one bringing us closer to our ultimate goal. In the weeks leading up to our departure, strange occurrences began to plague us. It started with vivid nightmares, shadowy figures moving through dense forests, eerie whispers carried on the wind. I dismissed them as pre-trip jitters, but Zach seemed more affected. He'd wake up in cold sweats, muttering about eyes in the dark. Then came the unexplained equipment malfunctions. Our perfectly maintained gear began to fail inexplicably. Compass needles spinning wildly, batteries draining overnight, even our trusty water filters clogging for no apparent reason. We chalked it up to bad luck and forged ahead with our preparations. The night before we left, I found Zach obsessively researching local legends and folklore associated with the Appalachian Trail. He showed me stories of hikers gone missing, tales of strange creatures lurking in the shadows, and ancient Native American warnings about forbidden paths through the mountains. I laughed it off, reminding him that every wilderness area had its share of spooky campfire stories. If only I had paid more attention to those warning signs. Our journey began on a crisp autumn morning, the air filled with the promise of adventure. The first week passed uneventfully, our spirits high as we settled into the rhythm of long-distance hiking. We marveled at the breathtaking vistas, bonded with fellow hikers at crowded shelters, and reveled in the simple pleasures of life on the trail. It was during our second week that things began to change. The other hikers seemed to thin out, leaving us alone for longer stretches. The forest around us grew denser, the silence more oppressive. Zach claimed he could feel eyes watching us from the undergrowth, but I dismissed his concerns as paranoia. Then came the day that would change everything. We had been pushing hard, hoping to reach a well-known camping area before nightfall. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across our path, we stumbled upon a sight that made my blood run cold. The first slash in the tent canvas was so perfect, so surgical, it almost looked deliberate. I traced my finger along the edge, feeling the frayed nylon threads. Whatever had done this wasn't just sharp, it was wickedly so. And as the fading daylight filtered through that precise cut, casting long shadows across the abandoned campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled into something far more sinister than a bear attack. My name's Ryan, and I've been hiking the Appalachian Trail with my best friend Zach for the past month. We're experienced backpackers, used to the challenges of long-distance trekking, but nothing in our years of outdoor adventures could have prepared us for what we found in that secluded clearing, deep in the heart of the Georgia wilderness. The day had started like any other on the trail. We'd broken camp at dawn, hoping to cover a good 15 miles before nightfall. The weather was perfect, cool and crisp, with just enough breeze to keep the bugs at bay. We'd made good time, pausing only for a quick lunch and the occasional water break. It was late afternoon when Zach spotted the first sign that something was off. "Hey Ryan," he called, pointing to a tree just off the trail. "Check this out." I walked over, squinting at the trunk. There, carved deep into the bark, was a crude symbol, a circle with a jagged line through it. The cuts looked fresh, the exposed wood still oozing sap. "Weird," I muttered. "Never seen a trail marker like that before." Zach shrugged. "Probably just some kid messing around." We pressed on, but I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the usual chorus of birdsong and insect buzz oddly muted, and I could have sworn I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, always just out of sight when I turned to look. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, we started looking for a suitable campsite. That's when we saw the clearing. It was perfect. A small, level area nestled between two rocky outcroppings, with a babbling stream nearby. But as we approached, we realized we weren't the first to discover this idyllic spot. The remains of a campsite lay before us, looking for all the world like its occupants had vanished in the middle of their stay. A tent stood in the center, its door flap open and swaying gently in the breeze. A small cooking pot sat on a makeshift fire pit, the ashes long cold. Backpacks and sleeping bags were scattered around, as if their owners had fled in a hurry. Zach and I exchanged glances. This wasn't normal. Even the messiest campers usually packed up before moving on. "Hello?" Zach called out. "Anyone here?" His voice echoed through the clearing, met only by the soft gurgle of the stream and the rustle of leaves overhead. We approached cautiously. That's when I noticed the first slash in the tent, and then another and another. The entire structure was riddled with them, each cut precise and deliberate. "What the hell?" I breathed, peering inside the ruined shelter. The interior was a mess. Sleeping bags were shredded, clothes strewn about. A flashlight lay on its side, its beam creating eerie shadows as it illuminated a small notebook. I picked it up, flipping it open to the last entry. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. "Day 3. It's still out there. We can hear it moving around the camp at night. The others think I'm crazy, but I know what I saw. It's not a bear. It's not anything natural. God help us if it gets in." I showed the notebook to Zach, watching as the color drained from his face. "We should go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There, half hidden beneath a torn sleeping bag, was a camera. My hands shook as I picked it up, praying the battery wasn't dead. It wasn't. The screen flickered to life, showing the last image taken. My heart nearly stopped. The photo was dark, clearly taken at night. But there, just at the edge of the frame, illuminated by the flash, was something, a shape that was almost human but not quite. Long, spindly limbs, a face that was more shadow than substance, and eyes that reflected the camera's flash like a cat's, but far larger. I dropped the camera, stumbling backward. "We need to leave. Now!" But as I turned, I realized with horror that the sun had nearly set. The forest around us was deepening into twilight, shadows lengthening and merging into an impenetrable gloom. Zach was already gathering his pack. "We can make it back to the trail if we hurry," he said, his voice tense. "We'll hike through the night if we have to." I nodded, snatching up my own backpack. But as I turned to go, a glint of metal caught my eye. There, half buried in the soft earth near the fire pit, was a small silver locket. Without thinking, I scooped it up and shoved it in my pocket. We set off at a brisk pace, trying to retrace our steps in the fading light, but nothing looked familiar. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. More than once I could have sworn I heard something moving in the underbrush, always just out of sight. "Do you remember that weird symbol we saw earlier?" Zach panted as we pushed through a particularly dense thicket. "I think I see another one." He was right. There, carved into a massive oak, was the same circle and line symbol we'd spotted before, but this one looked older, the edges of the carving weathered and moss-grown. "It's probably just a coincidence," I said, not believing my own words. "Come on, we need to keep moving." But as we pressed on, more symbols appeared. Some were fresh, others ancient. They seemed to be guiding us, though to what I couldn't say. The darkness was nearly complete now, our headlamps creating small islands of light in a sea of blackness. The forest had gone completely silent, save for the crunch of our boots on fallen leaves and the increasingly ragged sound of our breathing. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and a moan. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Zach froze. What was that? I shook my head, unable to speak. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that panicking now would only get us more lost. We pushed on, moving as quietly as we could. But the sounds continued, growing closer. Branches snapped behind us. Something rustled in the canopy overhead. And then, just ahead, I saw a flicker of movement. A shape, tall and impossibly thin, slipped between two trees. In the brief flash of my headlamp, I caught a glimpse of pale, elongated limbs, and a face that was little more than a dark void with pinpricks of reflected light where eyes should be. "Run!" I yelled, all thought of stealth forgotten. We crashed through the undergrowth, blind panic driving us forward. Branches whipped at our faces. Roots threatened to trip us at every step. The sounds behind us grew louder, a cacophony of inhuman shrieks and growls. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been minutes or hours, but suddenly, miraculously, we burst out onto a wide gravel road. A park ranger station stood just ahead, its windows glowing with welcoming light. We staggered towards it, gasping for breath. As we reached the door, I chanced to look back at the forest we'd just escaped. There, at the edge of the trees, stood a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. It raised a hand more claw than human appendage, and for a moment I thought it would pursue us into the light, but then it turned, melting back into the shadows of the forest. In seconds it was gone, leaving no trace of its presence. The rangers were skeptical of our story, of course. They attributed our experience to exhaustion, dehydration, and an overactive imagination. But they did send out a search party to investigate the abandoned campsite. They found nothing, no slashed tent, no scattered gear, not even a trace of a campfire. It was as if the entire scene had vanished into thin air. In the days that followed, as Zach and I recovered in a nearby town, I thought often of that silver locket I'd pocketed in my panic. When I finally worked up the courage to open it, I found a small photo inside. A smiling family, mother, father, 2 kids, posed in front of a familiar-looking clearing. I never reported finding the locket. Some part of me knew that doing so would only lead to more questions. questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Zach and I never finished our hike. By unspoken agreement, we packed up and headed home, our adventure on the Appalachian Trail cut short. We don't talk much about what happened in those woods, but sometimes on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking about that abandoned campsite, about the thing we saw in the forest, and I wonder with a chill that goes bone deep if somewhere out there, in the deepest, darkest parts of the wilderness, it's thinking about us too. The experience changed us both. Zach threw himself into researching similar incidents along the Appalachian Trail, uncovering a disturbing pattern of disappearances and unexplained phenomena stretching back decades. I found myself unable to shake the feeling that we'd glimpsed something beyond the veil of our normal reality, something ancient and terrifying that defied explanation. We've tried to move on with our lives, but the memory of that night haunts us still. Sometimes I catch Zach staring off into the distance, a haunted look in his eyes. And on quiet nights, when the wind rustles through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear that low, guttural moan echoing from the darkness. The silver locket sits in my desk drawer, a constant reminder of the mystery we left behind. I've thought about trying to track down the family in the photo, but something always holds me back. Maybe it's fear of stirring up painful memories, or maybe it's the nagging suspicion that some questions are better left unanswered. One thing is certain, our encounter in those Georgia woods has forever changed the way we see the world. The veil between our reality and something far stranger is thinner than most people realize. And sometimes, in the deepest parts of the wilderness, that veil can be torn away entirely, revealing horrors beyond imagination. As for the Appalachian Trail, it continues to draw hikers from around the world, most of them blissfully unaware of the dark secrets hidden in its shadowy depths. But for those who know where to look, the signs are there. Strange symbols carved into ancient trees, whispered warnings passed between seasoned hikers, and the occasional glimpse of something tall and impossibly thin moving just beyond the firelight. The wilderness holds many secrets, and not all of them are meant to be uncovered. Zach and I learned that lesson the hard way, and it's a burden we'll carry for the rest of our lives. So if you ever find yourself on the Appalachian Trail, and the silence of the forest grows too deep, or you catch a glimpse of movement just at the edge of your vision, don't investigate. Don't linger. Just run, and pray that whatever lurks in the shadows doesn't decide to follow you home. In the heart of America's heartland, where golden wheat fields stretch as far as the eye can see, lies a place known as Whispering Pines Farm. For generations, the Winters family had tended this land, their roots as deep as the ancient oaks that dotted the property. To the casual observer, it was a picture of rural tranquility, a haven untouched by the frantic pace of modern life. But beneath this serene facade, dark secrets lay buried, waiting to be unearthed. The year was 2025, and the world was grappling with unprecedented challenges. Climate change had altered weather patterns, making farming an even more precarious venture. Advances in genetic engineering promised to revolutionize agriculture, but also raised ethical concerns. Artificial intelligence was reshaping society in ways that previous generations could scarcely have imagined. Yet here, on Whispering Pines Farm, life seemed to follow the same rhythms it always had. The crops still needed planting and harvesting, the animals still needed tending, and the land still demanded respect and care. Or so I thought. My name is Zoe Chen, a recent graduate with a degree in agricultural biotechnology and a passion for sustainable farming practices. I'd come to Whispering Pines Farm with starry-eyed dreams of learning traditional techniques from old Mr. Winters. hoping to blend them with cutting-edge innovations to create a more resilient and productive future for agriculture. Little did I know that my journey would lead me to uncover a horrifying truth that would shatter my understanding of science, ethics, and the very nature of humanity itself. I arrived at Whispering Pines on a crisp spring morning, the air filled with the scent of blooming wildflowers and freshly tilled earth. Mr. Winters, a tall, weathered man with piercing blue eyes, greeted me with a firm handshake and a cautious smile. "Welcome to Whispering Pines, Miss Chen," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Hope you're ready for some hard work." The first few weeks passed in a blur of activity. I threw myself into farm life, learning the rhythms of the land and the quirks of the old machinery. Mr. Winters was a patient teacher, though he remained somewhat aloof. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding something back, watching me with a wariness that seemed out of place. It was on a sweltering summer day that everything changed. Mr. Winters had asked me to clear out one of the old barns, a massive structure that hadn't been used in years. "Been meaning to do it for ages," he'd grumbled. "Might as well put you to use on it. Just pile up anything that looks worth keeping. Haul the rest to the burn pile." The barn was a cavernous space, its interior dim and cool compared to the blistering heat outside. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through gaps in the weathered boards. The air was thick with the smell of old hay and something else, something chemical that I couldn't quite place. I started in one corner, sorting through piles of rusted farm equipment, moldering sacks of feed, and broken furniture. It was monotonous work, and my mind wandered as I hauled item after item to the growing pile outside. That's when I noticed the loose floorboard. I might have missed it entirely if my boot hadn't caught on the edge, nearly sending me sprawling. Curious, I knelt down to examine it. The board shifted easily under my hands, and as I lifted it, I saw a small space underneath, just big enough to hide something. The journal was wrapped in oilcloth, surprisingly well preserved considering its hiding place. I pulled it out, glancing over my shoulder guiltily, though I knew Mr. Winters was off in the fields. The leather-bound journal fell open in my hands, its yellowed pages releasing a musty cloud of dust and decay. At first, I thought it was just another relic of the farm's long history, maybe a record of crop yields or livestock lineages. But as my eyes skimmed the faded, spidery handwriting, my heart began to race. This was no ordinary farm ledger. The words human subject and genetic manipulation leapt out at me, and I realized with growing horror that I'd stumbled upon something far darker than I could have imagined. Little did I know this discovery would plunge me into a nightmare that would make me question everything I thought I knew about the quiet rural world around me. The journal belonged to a Dr. Victor Winters, dated 1954. Mr. Winters' father, I realized. But this was no ordinary farmer. The pages detailed complex scientific experiments, far beyond anything I'd learned in my biotechnology courses. Dr. Winters wrote about his attempts to create hardier, more productive livestock through genetic manipulation. But it wasn't just animals he was experimenting on. There were detailed notes about human subjects, vague references to volunteers from the local asylum. My hands shook as I turned the pages. Descriptions of failed experiments, of creatures that were neither fully human nor fully animal, sketches that turned my stomach, and throughout it all, a growing sense of the doctor's obsession, his conviction that he was on the verge of a breakthrough that would revolutionize agriculture and change the world. The final entry, dated 1963, was different. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. "It's done. The experiment was a success, but at what cost? They're out there now, hiding in the woods, in the fields. I can hear them at night, scratching at the walls. God forgive me for what I've created." I snapped the journal shut, my heart pounding. This had to be some kind of sick joke, right? Or maybe the ramblings of a madman. There was no way any of this could be real. But even as I tried to rationalize it, Memories of odd occurrences around the farm began to surface. The strange noises I'd heard at night dismissed as wildlife. The areas of the property Mr. Winters had warned me to avoid. The way the cattle sometimes seemed spooked by something I couldn't see. I shoved the journal back into its hiding place, my mind reeling. I needed to get out of this barn, to get some fresh air and clear my head. As I stepped outside, blinking in the harsh sunlight, I nearly ran into Mr. Winters. "Making progress?" he asked, eyeing the pile of junk I'd accumulated. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Did he know about the journal? About what his father had done? Mr. Winters' eyes narrowed slightly, as if sensing my unease. "Everything all right, Zoe? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," I managed to say. "Just, it's hot in there. Needed some air." He nodded slowly. "Well, don't work too hard. Come on up to the house when you're done. I'll fix us some dinner." I watched him walk away, trying to reconcile the kind, gruff old man I knew with the dark history I'd just uncovered. Was he continuing his father's work, or was he just as much a victim of it as anyone else? That night, as I lay in bed in the small apartment above the garage that Mr. Winters had given me, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old building, every rustle from the fields outside, set my nerves on edge. I kept thinking about the journal, about the creatures Dr. Winters had written about. Were they still out there, after all these years? A sudden noise outside my window made me bolt upright. It was a strange, guttural sound, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. My heart pounding, I crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. At first I saw nothing, but then movement caught my eye. Something was moving in the field beyond the barn, something large and definitely not a cow. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, and then it turned, and I caught a glimpse of its face in the moonlight. I stumbled back from the window, biting back a scream. What I'd seen, it wasn't human, but it wasn't fully animal either. It was something in between, something that should not exist. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed, every muscle tense, listening to the sounds of movement outside. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but relieved. Surely in the light of day, everything would make sense again. But as the days passed, strange occurrences began to multiply. Tools would go missing, only to turn up in odd places. The cattle grew increasingly agitated, especially at night. And more than once I caught Mr. Winters staring off into the woods with a troubled expression. I thought about leaving, about packing up my things and getting as far away from Whispering Pines Farm as I could. But something held me back. Curiosity, maybe, or a sense of responsibility. Whatever Dr. Winters had done, whatever he'd created, it was still out there. And maybe, just maybe, there was something I could do about it. I began my own investigations, carefully at first. I reread the journal, making notes, trying to understand the science behind Dr. Winters' experiments. I explored the far reaches of the property, areas Mr. Winters had told me to avoid, looking for signs of the creatures. And slowly, I started to piece together the truth. The experiments hadn't ended with Dr. Winters' last journal entry. They'd continued, passed down from father to son. Mr. Winters wasn't just aware of what his father had done, he was trying to fix it. It all came to a head one stormy night in late August. I was awakened by the sound of breaking glass and Mr. Winters' shouts. I raced to the farmhouse, rain lashing at my face, to find the front door splintered and hanging off its hinges. Inside, the scene was chaos. Furniture overturned, claw marks scoring the walls, and there, in the center of the living room, stood Mr. Winters, facing off against a creature that defied description. Part human, part animal, its body a patchwork of mismatched parts, its eyes glowing with an unnatural intelligence. "Zoe!" Mr. Winters yelled when he saw me. "The syringe, on the mantel." I saw it then, a large syringe filled with a glowing blue liquid. Without thinking, I grabbed it and tossed it to Mr. Winters. In one smooth motion, he caught it and plunged it into the creature's neck. The thing let out a howl that made my blood run cold. It thrashed wildly for a moment, then collapsed to the floor, its body seeming to melt and reform before my eyes. In moments, all that was left was an unconscious, very human-looking man. Mr. Winters sank to his knees, his face a mask of exhaustion and relief. "It's over," he murmured. "It's finally over." In the days that followed, Mr. Winters told me everything. How his father's experiments had created a handful of hybrid creatures. How they'd hidden in the woods for decades, occasionally venturing out to terrorize the farm. How he'd spent his life trying to find a cure, a way to reverse what his father had done. The man we'd captured that night was the last of them. With him cured, the long nightmare was finally over. But the weight of it, the dark legacy of Whispering Pines Farm, would stay with me forever. I still work the farm with Mr. Winters. We never spoke of that night to anyone else. Who would believe us? But sometimes on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the cornfields, I find myself scanning the tree line, wondering if we truly found them all. And I can't help but think about the thin line between scientific progress and playing God, and how easy it is to cross that line with the best of intentions. The secrets of Whispering Pines Farm are buried now, as they should be. But the lessons about responsibility, about the unforeseen consequences of our actions, those will stay with me always. As I continue my work on the farm, I'm more determined than ever to use my knowledge of biotechnology for good. I've started experimenting with more ethical and sustainable farming practices, always mindful of the potential consequences of pushing scientific boundaries too far. Mr. Winters and I have formed a partnership of sorts. He's teaching me the old ways of farming, the wisdom passed down through generations, while I'm introducing him to new techniques that could help the farm thrive in a changing world. It's a delicate balance, honoring tradition while embracing progress, but it feels right. We've turned one of the old barns into a research facility where we're developing drought-resistant crops and studying ways to improve soil health naturally. It's exciting work, but I never forget the lessons of the past. Every experiment is carefully documented, every potential risk assessed. The local community has started to take notice of our work. Other farmers come to us for advice, and we've even partnered with the nearby university on some research projects. It feels good to be making a positive difference, to be using science to help rather than harm. But the shadows of the past never fully fade. Sometimes, when I'm working late in the lab, I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, or hear a sound that doesn't quite fit. In those moments, my heart races, and I'm back in that moonlit field, staring at something that shouldn't exist. Mr. Winters assures me that it's just my imagination, that all the creatures have been cured. But I see the way his eyes dart to the tree line when he thinks I'm not looking, the way his hand sometimes strays to the locked drawer where he keeps a syringe of that glowing blue liquid, just in case. And so we continue our work, pushing forward into an uncertain future, always aware of the weight of the past. Whispering Pines Farm stands as a testament to both the potential and the perils of scientific advancement. It's a daily reminder that with great knowledge comes great responsibility. As I write this, the sun is setting over the fields, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The air is filled with the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. It's a beautiful, peaceful scene, the very picture of rural tranquility. But I know now that appearances can be deceiving, that beneath the surface of even the most idyllic setting, dark secrets can lurk. And as I look out over this land that has become my home, I make a silent promise to honor the past, to learn from its mistakes, and to work tirelessly to ensure that the horrors born in the shadows of Whispering Pines Farm never see the light of day again. For in the end, it's not just about farming or science or even ethics. It's about what it means to be human, and the responsibility we bear to use our knowledge and power wisely. The legacy of Whispering Pines Farm lives on through me, a constant reminder of the delicate balance between progress and preservation, innovation and integrity. And as I close my journal and prepare to face another day on this farm of secrets and shadows, I can't help but wonder, what other mysteries lie waiting to be uncovered in the quiet corners of the world? What other lines might we be tempted to cross in the name of progress? Only time will tell. But whatever comes, I'll face it with open eyes and a cautious heart, always mindful of the lessons learned in the whispers of the pines. The day started like any other. I was driving my old beaten-up pickup truck through the empty highways of New Mexico, the desert stretching out on both sides, nothing but scrub and dirt as far as the eye could see. The year was 1997, and I was headed back to my hometown after spending some time out west working on construction sites. My name's Darren Red Horse, and I'm full-blood Navajo. I've always been proud of my heritage, but the life I've lived, well, it's been far from easy. My mom raised me on the reservation after my dad passed, and it was tough. It's always been just her and me scraping by. I left as soon as I could, joined the Army, and spent 6 years overseas. When I came back, everything had changed. The reservation was struggling even more, and I couldn't find steady work. So I bounced around doing jobs nobody else wanted, barely getting by, but I stayed close to my mom. She's the only family I've got left. That day, I was driving to visit her. She had called me 2 days before, sounding a little off, like she was nervous about something. She didn't say much, just that she wanted me to come home for a few days. I figured she just needed help with something around the house. It wasn't unusual. The road was quiet, not a single car passed me for hours, and the sun was starting to dip in the sky when I noticed the gas light flick on. There was a station coming up in about 15 miles. I knew it well, run by an old family friend, Sam Begay. It was one of those places where you could still sit outside, sip on a Coke, and listen to stories from the locals. Sam was like an uncle to me growing up. As I drove, my mind wandered to the stories Sam used to tell. He was a repository of Navajo legends, always ready with a tale about skinwalkers, shapeshifters, or other creatures that lurked in the shadows of our world. I used to love those stories as a kid, but after what I'd seen in the Army, I'd come to realize that the real monsters in this world were human. The desert seemed to stretch on forever, the heat shimmering off the asphalt, creating mirages in the distance. I rolled down the windows, letting the warm air whip through the cab of the truck. The radio crackled with static, picking up fragments of a news broadcast talking about cattle mutilations in the area. I fiddled with the dial, trying to get a clearer signal, but gave up after a few minutes. As I approached the gas station, a sense of unease began to creep over me. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was something else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The station came into view, a lone outpost in the vast expanse of the desert. Sam's old pickup was parked out front, a layer of dust on the windshield, but there was no sign of life. I pulled into the station, the gravel crunching under my tires. The place seemed deserted. Sam wasn't there, which was unusual. He was always out front, ready to greet customers with a smile and a story. The pumps were working, so I filled up the tank, the smell of gasoline sharp in the dry air. Figuring Sam must have stepped out, I went inside to pay. The moment I opened the door, I knew something was wrong. The air inside was off. It smelled wrong, like something had gone bad in the heat. The aisles were all messed up, cans of beans and bags of chips scattered across the floor. "Sam?" I called out, but there was no answer. The station wasn't big, just a counter, a few rows of snacks and supplies, and a back room where Sam would sometimes nap. I checked behind the counter, thinking maybe he'd left a note or something, but there was nothing. Just silence. I was about to head back outside when I heard a sound. It was faint, coming from the back of the store, near the storeroom door. It was slow, almost like breathing, but it had a wet quality to it. You know when someone's hurt bad and they're struggling to breathe? It was like that. My military training kicked in. I grabbed the tire iron from my truck and approached the storeroom door cautiously. The metal was cool in my hand, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and pushed the door open. The room was dark except for a small window near the ceiling that let in the last light of the day. As my eyes adjusted, I saw a shape on the floor. My heart sank as I recognized Sam's familiar plaid shirt. In the middle of the floor lay a body. It was Sam, face down, his legs twisted in a way that didn't look natural. I rushed over to him, but when I knelt down, I saw that it was too late. His throat had been torn open and there was blood everywhere pooling under him. I stood there for a second, trying to process it. Sam was dead, and whatever had done this was either long gone or still close by. The thought made my stomach drop. I backed out of the storeroom, my grip tightening on the tire iron. I needed to get out of there and call for help. The nearest town was a good 20 miles away, but I had a cell phone, though service was spotty out here. I fumbled with it, trying to dial 911, but of course there was no signal. Then I heard it, a scraping sound, like claws on concrete coming from outside the station. My heart pounded as I slowly moved to the front of the store, keeping low. Whatever it was circling the building, and it was big. From the shadows outside, I could make out a shape moving in front of the headlights of my truck. It was huge, hunched over with thick, matted fur that reminded me of a wolf, but not quite. This thing was bigger than any animal I had ever seen, its body contorting in unnatural ways as if its limbs didn't fit right. I crouched behind the counter, barely daring to breathe, praying it wouldn't come inside. My mind raced, trying to think of what the hell could have done that to Sam. Maybe it was some kind of mutated wolf. Coyotes didn't get this big, and bears were rare in this part of the state. The scratching stopped, and for a moment everything was silent. I thought maybe it had gone. But then the door creaked open. My heart nearly stopped as the beast stepped into the store. Its head was low, sniffing the air, and I could see its jaws hanging open, blood dripping from its teeth. It was closer now, and I could see that its face was almost canine, but wrong, like something had tried to fuse a wolf with something else. The skin on its snout was stretched tight, revealing too many teeth. I didn't even breathe. The thing was sniffing the air, searching, and I knew if it got a good whiff of me, I was done. But then in the corner of the store, a can rolled off a shelf, clattering loudly to the floor. The creature snapped its head toward the noise and let out a snarl that made my stomach turn. In an instant, it bounded toward the sound, smashing into the shelves like a freight train. This was my chance. While it was distracted, I bolted for the door, running as fast as I could to the truck. I jumped in, slamming the door shut, but as I fumbled for the keys, I realized I had left them on the counter inside. My heart sank. I looked back at the store. The creature was still inside, crashing through the shelves, searching for whatever made that noise. I couldn't stay here, but I wasn't going to make it far on foot either. That's when I saw the keys to Sam's old truck hanging from a hook near the garage door. I made a run for it, ducking behind a row of fuel tanks. The truck was just a few yards away, and I could hear the thing inside, still tearing apart the store. I grabbed the keys and unlocked the truck, praying it would start. The engine sputtered to life, and I floored it, peeling out of the station and onto the highway. In the rearview mirror, I saw the beast burst through the front of the station, charging after me on all fours. It was faster than anything that size had a right to be, but I kept driving, pushing the old truck as hard as it could go. After what felt like hours, I didn't see it anymore. I made it back to town and went straight to the sheriff. I told him everything about Sam, about the creature, but when they sent a team out to the station the next day, all they found was Sam's body. The thing was gone. They believed me, though. The sheriff, a Navajo man himself, said he had heard stories from the old-timers about creatures like this, things that didn't belong to this world. He didn't give it a name, and I didn't ask. I haven't been back to that part of the desert since, but sometimes when the wind howls at night, I swear I can hear that creature snarl, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd seen. The image of that creature, its unnatural form and bloodied maw, haunted my dreams. I stayed with my mother, helping her around the house as I'd originally planned, but my mind was elsewhere. She could tell something was wrong. "Darren," she said one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the desert. "What's troubling you? You've been different since you got here." I wanted to tell her everything, but how could I explain what I'd seen? How could I put into words the horror of finding Sam's body, of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist? Instead, I just shook my head. "It's nothing, Mom. Just tired from the drive." But she knew better. She always did. She reached out and took my hand. Her skin weathered and wrinkled, but still strong. "There are things in this world that we don't understand, Darren. Things that our ancestors knew about, but that we've forgotten." I looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" She sighed, her eyes distant. "Your grandfather used to tell stories about shapeshifters and skinwalkers. I always thought they were just tales to scare children, but now, I'm not so sure." A chill ran down my spine. "Mom, what are you saying?" She squeezed my hand. "I'm saying that whatever you saw out there, whatever happened to Sam, it might be connected to something old, something that's been asleep for a long time." I wanted to dismiss her words, to chalk it up to superstition, but after what I'd seen, I couldn't. "What woke it up?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. "I don't know, but there have been signs. The cattle mutilations, strange tracks in the desert, people going missing. Something's stirring out there, Darren, and I'm afraid it's only the beginning." The next day, I decided to do some digging. If what my mother said was true, if there really was something out there connected to our old stories, I needed to know more. I started at the local library, poring over old newspapers and books on Navajo legends. As I researched, a pattern began to emerge. Every few decades, there would be a spike in strange occurrences. Livestock found torn apart, hikers disappearing without a trace, sightings of creatures that didn't match any known animal. And each time the incidents would cluster around certain areas of the desert. One name kept coming up: Chaco Canyon, an ancient site, sacred to the Pueblo people, with a history stretching back over 1,000 years. According to the legends, it was a place of power, a gateway between worlds. I remembered visiting Chaco Canyon as a kid, marveling at the ancient structures and intricate petroglyphs. But now, thinking about those ruins in the context of what I'd seen, a new fear gripped me. What if those ancient people had built those structures not just as homes or ceremonial sites, but as a way to contain something? My research led me to an old man named John Sosi, a tribal elder known for his knowledge of the old ways. I found him living on the outskirts of town, in a small house surrounded by juniper trees. When I told him what I'd seen, he nodded gravely. "We have a name for creatures like the one you described," he said, his voice rough with age. "We call them Yi-Naldlushi, skinwalkers. But this one sounds different, older, more powerful." "What is it?" I asked. John's eyes met mine, and I saw fear there. "There are some things, Darren, that are better left unnamed. Naming them gives them power. But I can tell you this: what you encountered is a guardian of sorts, a protector of ancient places and old magic. And if it's awake and hunting, then something has disturbed its rest. Chaco Canyon, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. John's eyebrows shot up. How do you know about that? I explained my research, the patterns I'd found. John listened intently, his expression growing more troubled with each word. You're on dangerous ground, Darren, he said when I finished. But you might be right. There's been talk of a new development project near Chaco Canyon, some big corporation wanting to build a resort or something. If they've disturbed something they shouldn't have. He trailed off, but I understood the implication. Whatever I'd encountered at Sam's gas station might just be the beginning. Armed with this new information, I knew I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. Whatever was happening, whatever had been awakened, it was connected to my people, to our land. I had a responsibility to do something about it. I told my mother I was heading back out west for work, but the truth was, I was going back to where it all started, back to Sam's gas station, and from there, to Chaco Canyon. The drive back was tense. Every shadow on the road seemed to move, every rustle in the brush along the highway made me jump. But I pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and determination. When I reached Sam's station, the place was deserted. Yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, and the front of the building was still smashed in from where the creature had burst through. I parked a little way down the road and approached on foot, my heart pounding. The inside of the station was a mess, dried blood staining the floor where Sam had fallen. I stood there for a moment, remembering my old friend, and silently promised him that I'd get to the bottom of this. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There, half hidden under a fallen shelf, was a scrap of paper. I picked it up, my hands shaking slightly. It was a receipt, but not from the gas station. It was for a construction company, Red Rock Development Corp., with an address near Chaco Canyon. This had to be connected to what John had told me about the development project. I pocketed the receipt and headed back to my truck. As I drove towards Chaco Canyon, the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of red and gold. I knew I was driving towards danger, towards something ancient and powerful that had already killed once. But I also knew I didn't have a choice. Whatever was out there, whatever had been awakened, it was a threat to everything and everyone I cared about. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I didn't know what I'd find at Chaco Canyon, but I was determined to face it, for Sam, for my people, and for the desert itself. The road stretched out before me, leading into the heart of the ancient lands. And somewhere out there, in the gathering darkness, I knew the creature was waiting. As I approached Chaco Canyon, the landscape became increasingly rugged. The road wound through towering mesas and deep arroyos, the ancient structures of the ancestral Puebloans looming in the distance. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert floor. I parked my truck near the visitor center, which was closed at this late hour. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional cry of a coyote in the distance. I grabbed my flashlight and a backpack with some water and supplies, then set out towards the heart of the ruins. The great houses of Chaco Canyon stood like sentinels in the moonlight. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of the structures, was a maze of stone walls and empty windows. As I walked through the ancient city, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I pulled out the receipt I'd found at Sam's gas station and studied the address again. The construction site should be just beyond the protected area of the park. As I hiked in that direction, I noticed something odd. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt, leading off the main road and into a narrow canyon. Following the tracks, I soon came upon a makeshift camp. Construction equipment sat idle in the moonlight, and a few temporary buildings had been set up. But something was wrong. The camp was deserted, and there were signs of a struggle. Overturned chairs, scattered papers, and was that blood on the ground? My heart raced as I investigated further. In one of the buildings, I found a stack of documents: plans for a resort complex, environmental impact studies, and my blood ran cold. There was a map of the canyon with certain areas marked in red. One of them corresponded to where Sam's gas station had been. Suddenly, a low growl broke the silence. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, at the edge of the camp, stood the creature. It was even more terrifying than I remembered. In the moonlight, I could see that its fur was patchy, revealing leathery skin underneath. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural yellow light. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. The creature took a step forward, its massive claws leaving deep gouges in the earth. Then, to my horror, it began to change. Its form shifted and twisted, becoming more humanoid. Within moments, a man stood where the beast had been, but his eyes were still those of the creature. "You should not have come here, Darren Redhorse," the man said, his voice a guttural rasp. I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The man or creature, I wasn't sure what to call it anymore, took another step towards me. "How do you know my name?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. The being tilted its head, a gesture that was disturbingly inhuman despite its now human form. "I know many things, Darren. I have watched your people for centuries. I have protected these lands since before your ancestors first set foot here." My mind reeled. This shapeshifter, was claiming to be some kind of ancient guardian? "Protected?" I spat out. "You killed Sam. You've been terrorizing people." A look of what might have been sadness crossed the being's face. Samuel Begay was an unfortunate necessity. He discovered something he should not have. As for the others, I do what I must to keep the ancient powers contained. I glanced at the documents I'd found. What does this construction have to do with it? Why are you attacking these sites? The being's eyes flashed, a hint of its bestial nature showing through. The fools who would build here do not understand what they are disturbing. Beneath this land lie forces beyond their comprehension. The great houses, the kivas, they were not just dwellings and ceremonial sites. They were prisons, Darren. Prisons for things that should never again walk this earth. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered John Sosie's words about Chaco Canyon being a gateway between worlds. "What kind of things?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. The being's form shimmered, as if it was struggling to maintain its human shape. Gods, demons, creatures from the stars. The names do not matter. What matters is that they remain bound. But the digging, the construction, it weakens the seals. Already some have begun to stir. I thought of the cattle mutilations, the missing people. That was you, trying to stop the construction. The being nodded. I am the last of the guardians, Darren. The old ways are forgotten. The rituals to keep the binding strong lost to time. I do what I can, but I am limited. Limited how? I asked, my fear slowly being replaced by a morbid curiosity. The being's form shimmered again, and for a moment I saw the beast beneath. The price of immortality is high, Darren. To maintain my vigil, I must feed on flesh and fear. It is not a choice I made lightly, but it is necessary. I felt sick. This guardian had been killing people like Sam, to fuel its own existence. But if what it was saying was true, the alternative could be far worse. Why are you telling me all this? I asked. The being's eyes met mine, and I saw the weight of centuries in them. Because you are of the people, Darren. You carry the old blood, and because I am tired, so very tired. As the implications of the guardian's words sank in, I felt the weight of an impossible decision settling on my shoulders. This being, this shapeshifter, had killed my friend. It had terrorized my people for who knows how long. Every instinct told me it was a monster that needed to be stopped. But if what it was saying was true, if it really was the only thing standing between our world and forces of unimaginable horror, "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The Guardian's form shimmered again, and I caught glimpses of other shapes, a coyote, an eagle, a bear, before it settled back into its human guise. "I offer you a choice, Darren Redhorse. Join me, become a Guardian. With your help we can stop this construction, reinforce the bindings, and keep the ancient evils at bay." I stared at the being in disbelief. "Become like you? A killer?" The Guardian shook its head. "Not necessarily. The old ways are not entirely lost. With study, with dedication, we might find another way. But it will not be an easy path. You will have to leave your old life behind." I thought of my mother, of the life I'd been trying to build. Could I really give all that up? But then I thought of Sam, of the wider consequences if this being was telling the truth. "And if I refuse?" I asked. The Guardian's eyes hardened. "Then I will do what I must, alone. And I cannot promise that your people will be spared in the conflict to come." I closed my eyes, trying to think. Part of me wanted to run, to dismiss this all as the ravings of a monster trying to justify its actions. But deep down, I knew. I knew that what I'd seen, what I'd experienced, was only the tip of something much larger and more terrifying. "If I agree," I said slowly, "I want your word that no more innocent people will die. We find another way." The Guardian nodded solemnly. "You have my word, Darren Redhorse. We will seek an alternative path. But know this: the road ahead will be long and fraught with danger. The forces we stand against are patient, but they are also relentless." I took a deep breath, knowing that my next words would change my life forever. "Then I accept. Teach me. Show me how to be a Guardian." A look of relief passed over the being's face, so human in that moment that it was hard to reconcile with the monstrous form I'd seen earlier. "Thank you, Darren. You have made a wise choice, though I know it does not feel that way now." As if to emphasize the gravity of the moment, a tremor passed through the earth. In the distance I heard what sounded like stone grinding against stone. The Guardian's head snapped up, its eyes wide with alarm. "It's starting. We must hurry. Your training begins now, Darren. Are you ready?" I nodded, pushing aside my fear and doubt. Whatever was coming, whatever ancient horrors were stirring beneath Chaco Canyon, I had made my choice. I would stand against them, learn the old ways, and protect my people, protect the world, no matter the cost. As we moved deeper into the canyon, the air grew thick with an otherworldly energy. The Guardian began to shift forms again, this time taking on the shape of a massive owl. It spread its wings, beckoning me to follow. I cast one last look back at the construction camp, at the world I was leaving behind. Then, steeling myself for whatever lay ahead, I followed the Guardian into the heart of Chaco Canyon, towards a destiny I could never have imagined. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion, fear, and wonder. The Guardian, who told me to call him Neil, though I suspected this wasn't his true name, began my training immediately. We moved through the canyon like shadows, always staying one step ahead of the construction crews and the park rangers. Neil taught me the secret paths through the desert, showing me how to move without leaving tracks, how to blend with the landscape until I was nearly invisible. But more importantly, he began teaching me the old ways, the forgotten lore of my people. "The power is in the land," Neil explained as we sat atop a mesa, watching the sunrise. "It flows through the rocks, the plants, the very air we breathe. Your ancestors knew how to tap into this power, how to use it to maintain the balance." I listened intently, trying to absorb every word. It was hard to reconcile this patient teacher with the terrifying creature I'd first encountered, but I was beginning to understand the complexity of Neol's existence. "But how does this help us stop whatever's trying to break free?" I asked. Neol's eyes, currently those of an eagle, fixed on me. "The bindings that hold the Ancient Ones are not just physical, Darren. They are woven into the very fabric of this place. By learning to sense and manipulate the land's energy, we can strengthen those bindings." He instructed me to close my eyes and place my hands on the sun-warmed stone. "Feel the pulse of the earth," he said. "Listen to its rhythm." At first I felt nothing, but as the minutes ticked by, I began to sense something. A faint thrumming, like a distant heartbeat, and with it came flashes of memory, images of ancient peoples, of rituals performed under starlit skies, of battles fought against shadowy, monstrous forms. I gasped and pulled my hands away. "What was that?" Neol nodded approvingly. "You're beginning to see, to feel. The land remembers, Darren. It carries the echoes of all that has happened here. In time, you'll learn to interpret these echoes, to use them to guide your actions." As the days passed, my senses sharpened. I began to perceive the world in ways I never had before. The desert came alive with unseen currents of energy, and I learned to draw upon this energy, to shape it with my will. But it wasn't all mystical training. Neol also taught me practical skills: how to track, how to fight, how to survive in the harshest conditions. "A guardian must be prepared for anything," he said. One night, as we sat around a small hidden fire, I finally asked the question that had been gnawing at me. "Neol, how did you become what you are?" The guardian was silent for a long moment, his form shifting restlessly between human and animal shapes. Finally he spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of centuries. "I was once like you, Darren, a young warrior of my people, chosen to undergo the guardian ritual. But something went wrong. The power, it was too much. It changed me, twisted me into something between man and beast. For a long time I raged against what I had become. But eventually I understood the necessity of my transformation. I listened, transfixed, as Neol recounted centuries of standing watch, of fighting back the darkness that constantly threatened to spill into our world. His tale was one of sacrifice, of unimaginable loneliness, but also of unwavering purpose. As he finished, I felt a mix of awe and sadness. Will I become like you?" I asked hesitantly. Neol shook his head. "No, Darren. Your path will be different. You are of a new generation with new strengths. You will face your own trials, but you need not fear the fate that befell me." His words were reassuring, but as I drifted off to sleep that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that my trials were only just beginning. Weeks passed, and I immersed myself in my training. The outside world felt distant, almost unreal. My mother must be worried sick, I knew, but I couldn't risk contacting her. Not yet. Not until I understood more, until I was sure I could protect her. Neol and I moved through the canyons and mesas like ghosts, always watching, always listening. We sabotaged construction equipment when we could, misdirected survey teams, did everything possible to slow the progress of the Red Rock Development Corps. But despite our efforts, the work continued, and with each passing day I could feel something growing stronger, a presence, vast and alien, stirring in the depths beneath Chaco Canyon. One night I was jolted awake by a tremor that shook the earth. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. Neol was already up, his form flickering between shapes as if he couldn't maintain any single one. "It's time," he said grimly. "They're making their move." We raced through the darkness towards the main construction site. As we crested a rise, I saw a sight that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The site was ablaze with unnatural light. Workers ran screaming as the ground beneath their feet writhed and buckled. And there, at the center of it all, was a hole. A pit that seemed to go down forever, pulsing with a sickly, otherworldly glow. Standing at the edge of the pit was a man in an expensive suit, the CEO of Red Rock Development, I guessed. But something was wrong with him. His eyes glowed with the same light as the pit, and his mouth was stretched in a rictus grin that was too wide, too full of teeth to be human. "Fool," Neil growled. "He thinks he can control them, use their power. He has no idea what he's unleashing." As we watched in horror, a shape began to emerge from the pit. It was vast, defying description. Tentacles, wings, eyes, all shifting and changing, never settling into any recognizable form. The very air seemed to warp around it. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice shaking. Neil turned to me, his eyes blazing with an inner fire. "Remember your training, Darren. Remember the power of this land. We are the Guardians. We stand between this world and the chaos that would consume it. Are you ready?" I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of generations of Guardians who had come before me. I reached out with my senses, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath my feet, the whispers of ancient power in the air. "I'm ready," I said, and I meant it. Together, Neol and I began to chant, calling upon the power of the land, the strength of our ancestors. The air around us began to shimmer as we wove a barrier of energy, pushing back against the emerging horror. The creature from the pit roared, a sound that threatened to shatter my sanity. The possessed CEO turned towards us, his inhuman grin widening impossibly further. "You're too late," he said, his voice echoing with otherworldly harmonics. "The gateway is open. They are coming through. This world will be remade in their image." Neol snarled, his form expanding into something massive and terrifying, a fusion of all his animal aspects into one incredible being. "Not while we stand, abomination." As Neol leaped towards the monstrous entity emerging from the pit, I focused all my energy on maintaining our protective barrier. The air crackled with power, ancient symbols flickering in and out of existence around us. The creature lashed out with impossibly long limbs, each movement distorting the very fabric of reality. Neol met its attack with primal fury, his form constantly shifting to match each new threat. They clashed in a battle that defied comprehension, a whirlwind of teeth, claws, and otherworldly. Meanwhile, I found myself facing the possessed CEO. He advanced on me, that inhuman grin never leaving his face. "Join us, young Guardian," he said, his voice a cacophony of whispers. "Embrace the chaos. Become a god." I stood my ground, drawing upon every lesson Neol had taught me. "I am Darren Redhorse," I declared, my voice stronger than I felt. "I am a guardian of this land, and you are not welcome here." With those words, I felt something unlock within me. The power of the land surged through my body, and suddenly I could see the threads of energy connecting everything, the rocks, the air, the ancient structures of Chaco Canyon. And I could see how to weave those threads into a weapon. I began to chant in a language I didn't know I remembered, my hands moving in intricate patterns. The possessed CEO's smile faltered as he felt the power building around me. He lunged forward, but it was too late. A blast of pure energy erupted from my hands, catching him square in the chest. He flew backwards, his body disintegrating into motes of sickly light that were quickly swallowed by the darkness. I turned my attention to the pit, where Neol was still locked in combat with the emerging entity. Despite his incredible power, I could see that Neol was being slowly overwhelmed. The creature was simply too vast, too alien for any single being to defeat. But we were not alone. As I reached out with my newfound senses, I felt the presence of countless others, the spirits of guardians past, the echoes of ancient rituals, the very soul of the land itself. All of it was there, waiting to be called upon. "Neol!" I shouted. "The binding! We need to remake the binding!" Understanding flashed in his eyes. With a monumental effort, he disengaged from the creature and fell back to my side. Together, we began to chant, our voices joining with those of 1,000 generations of guardians. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the power of our ritual. Strands of energy began to coalesce around the pit, weaving together into an intricate net. The emerging entity roared in defiance, thrashing against the forming barriers, but it was too late. With a final surge of power, the binding snapped into place. The creature was drawn back into the pit, its unearthly screams fading as reality knitted itself back together. The unnatural light dimmed, then winked out entirely, leaving us in the soft pre-dawn glow of the desert. For a long moment, neither Niol nor I moved, scarcely daring to believe it was over. Then, slowly, Niol's form shimmered and settled into his human aspect. He looked at me with a mixture of pride and sadness. "It's done," he said softly. "The binding is remade, stronger than before. But our work is not over, Darren. It never will be." I nodded, understanding the weight of the responsibility I had accepted. "What now?" I asked. Niol gestured to the construction site, now eerily silent and still. "We clean up. We make sure no trace of what happened here remains. And then, we watch, we wait. We stand ready for the next threat, whatever form it may take." As the sun rose over Chaco Canyon, Niol and I set about our task. We buried the pit, erased all signs of the eldritch horror that had nearly been unleashed. To the outside world, it would appear as if the Red Rock Development Project had simply been abandoned, another failed venture in the harsh desert landscape. In the days that followed, I returned home briefly. I hugged my mother, told her I loved her, and tried to explain that I had found my purpose, even if I couldn't fully describe what that purpose was. It was hard leaving her again, but I knew it was necessary. Niol and I established a network of guardians, recruiting others who showed sensitivity to the old ways. We became the silent protectors of the Southwest, standing watch against threats most of the world would never know existed. Years passed. I aged, but slowly the power I had embraced granting me a measure of Niol's longevity. I saw the world change, saw my people face new challenges and triumphs. Through it all, I remained true to my calling. Sometimes, on quiet nights beneath the vast desert sky, I think back to that fateful day at Sam's gas station. I mourn for the life I left behind, for the normal existence I might have had. But then I feel the pulse of the land beneath my feet, sense the ancient power that flows through this timeless landscape, and I know I made the right choice. I am Darren Redhorse, guardian of the desert, protector of the old ways, and as long as I draw breath, I will stand against the darkness that threatens to consume us all. The soft hum of washing machines filled the air as I made my way down the dimly lit hallway of my apartment complex. It was another late night, and the familiar weight of my laundry basket pressed against my hip. The December chill had settled into the bones of the building, making the warmth of the laundromat all the more inviting. I've always been a night owl, finding a strange comfort in the solitude of late-night chores. There's something oddly peaceful about the world when most people are asleep. A quiet that settles over everything like a blanket. It's in these moments that I feel most at ease, most myself. As I pushed open the door to the laundromat, the fluorescent lights flickered to life, casting a harsh glow over the rows of machines. The room was empty, as it usually was at this hour. I set my basket down on one of the folding tables and began the familiar routine of sorting clothes and loading washers. The complex I live in is nestled on the outskirts of a small town in western New York, about an hour's drive from Lake Ontario. It's an unremarkable place in many ways, a collection of weathered brick buildings surrounded by patches of dense forest. A river runs nearby, its gentle rush a constant background noise that you only really notice when it's gone. As I waited for my clothes to wash, I pulled out my phone, scrolling mindlessly through social media. The minutes ticked by, marked only by the rhythmic tumbling of the machines. It was nearing 8:30 p.m. when I felt it, a sudden shift in the air, like a change in pressure before a storm. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the distinct sensation of being watched. I turned around, half expecting to see another tenant who had decided to do some late-night laundry. But the room was empty, the door still firmly closed. That's when I saw it. A face pressed against the window, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. The laundromat lights, programmed to shut off at 7 p.m. to save energy, had long since gone dark. The only illumination came from the small dollar store flashlight I had propped up on one of the machines, a habit I'd developed over months of late-night laundry sessions. The weak light barely reached the corners of the room, leaving the windows shrouded in shadow. But even in that dim light, I could make out details that sent a chill down my spine. The face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. Its eyes were sunken deep into their sockets, glinting with an unnatural light. The pallor of its skin was striking, a sickly white that spoke of years without sunlight. For a moment, we locked eyes, and I felt a primal fear grip my heart. This wasn't a person, at least not any kind of person I'd ever seen before. As my brain struggled to process what I was seeing, the creature moved. It didn't just turn away, it skittered, like some nightmarish spider, dropping to all fours and scampering off into the darkness of the forest. The movement was what struck me most. I've seen people run on all fours before, kids playing or the occasional eclectic fitness enthusiast. But it always looks unnatural, awkward, like our bodies aren't meant to move that way. This thing, whatever it was, moved with a fluid grace that defied explanation. It was as if running on four limbs was its natural state, and walking upright would have been the aberration. For several long moments after it disappeared, I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a hallucination, a trick of the light in my tired mind. But I knew what I had seen was real as the cold sweat now beating on my forehead. I finished my laundry in record time that night, constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that emaciated face appear at the window again. As I hurried back to my apartment, laundry basket clutched tightly to my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The patches of forest that I had always found charming now seemed menacing, full of shadows that could be hiding who knows what. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself growing increasingly paranoid. Every time I walked near the edge of the forest, I felt eyes on me. It wasn't just the normal wariness you might feel in a secluded area at night. This was different, a predatory gaze that made me feel like prey. The rational part of my mind tried to dismiss it. After all, there were no large predators in our area. The worst we had to contend with were the occasional coyotes, and they generally stayed away from populated areas. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. I started taking different routes to and from my apartment, avoiding the areas closest to the forest. I began to dread nightfall, drawing my curtains tightly closed as soon as the sun began to set. Sleep became elusive, my dreams haunted by visions of that skeletal face and those unnaturally fluid movements. About a month after the incident at the laundromat, I noticed something odd. The lights in my apartment started behaving strangely. They would flicker on and off at random intervals, sometimes staying off for several seconds before suddenly blazing back to life. At first, I assumed it was just faulty wiring or maybe a problem with the building's electrical system. I called the maintenance team, who checked the breakers and the wiring in my apartment. They found nothing wrong. I even hired an electrician to take a look, but he too was baffled. The lights continued their erratic behavior, and soon I noticed it wasn't just confined to my apartment. The hallway lights, the outdoor lamps around the complex, they all seemed to be affected. The unpredictable lighting only added to my growing sense of unease. In the moments when the lights would suddenly cut out, I found myself holding my breath, straining my ears for any sound of movement. More than once, I thought I caught a glimpse of something pale and skeletal in the split second before the lights came back on, but it was always gone too quickly for me to be sure. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself researching the area around our apartment complex, looking for any clues that might explain what I'd seen that night. That's when I came across the stories about the highway. Just a stone's throw from our complex, running parallel to the river, is a stretch of road that locals have dubbed the Highway of Death. Since 2012, it's claimed the lives of at least 8 or 9 people. The accidents always seem to happen at night, often in clear weather with no obvious cause. I couldn't help but wonder if there was a connection. Was the creature I saw somehow linked to these deaths? Were the victims unlucky motorists who had encountered something they couldn't explain, something that had run them off the road? The more I thought about it, the more connections I began to see. The river that ran alongside the highway, could it be providing a hidden pathway for the creature to move unseen? The forest patches around our complex, were they part of a larger network that this thing used to navigate the area undetected? I found myself spending hours online, scouring local news sites and forums for any mention of strange sightings or unexplained events. Most of what I found was easily dismissible, the usual Bigfoot stories and UFO sightings that every small town seems to accumulate. But every now and then I'd come across something that made me pause. A hiker who claimed to have seen something not quite human moving through the trees at dusk. A late-night driver who swerved to avoid what he described as an emaciated, pale figure that darted across the highway. A local legend about river people who lived in caves along the waterway, emerging only at night to hunt. None of it was conclusive, of course. These could all be explained away as misidentifications, hoaxes, or urban legends. But in light of what I had seen, they took on a new significance. Each story, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, added another piece to a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. As spring arrived, bringing with it longer days and warmer temperatures, I found myself at a crossroads. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was lurking in those woods. But another part of me, a part I didn't fully understand, felt compelled to stay, to investigate further, to find out the truth about what I had seen that night in the laundromat. I began to take late-night walks along the edge of the forest, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. I bought a high-powered flashlight and a small camera, hoping to capture evidence of something, anything that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. Most nights, nothing happened. The forest remained still and silent, revealing none of its secrets. But every so often I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a flash of pale skin in the underbrush, the sound of something moving within human speed through the trees. One night, about 6 months after my initial encounter, I decided to venture closer to the river. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. As I approached the water's edge, I heard a splash that was too large to be a fish. I swung my flashlight towards the sound, and for a brief moment I saw it again. The creature was crouched at the water's edge, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the moonlit river. It turned its head towards me, those sunken eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight like a cat's. For a heartbeat we stared at each other, and I felt a jolt of recognition. It was the same creature I had seen that night in the laundromat. Before I could react, it dove into the water with barely a ripple. I rushed to the bank, scanning the surface of the river, but there was no sign of it. It was as if it had simply vanished. That encounter left me shaken but more determined than ever to uncover the truth. I began to map out the areas where I had seen or felt the creature's presence. I noted the dates and times of the strange occurrences with the lights. I even started reaching out to some of the people whose stories I had read online, hoping to corroborate their experiences with my own. As I delved deeper into my investigation, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of uncovering something big, something that would change not just my understanding of this small corner of New York, but perhaps our understanding of what kind of creatures share this world with us. But with each step forward in my investigation, the sense of being watched, of being hunted, grew stronger. The lights in my apartment and around the complex continued their erratic behavior, and I often woke in the night to the sound of scratching at my windows. I know that continuing down this path could be dangerous. Whatever this creature is, it's clearly aware of me and my efforts to understand it. But I've come too far to turn back now. The mystery of what lurks in the forests and rivers around my home has become an obsession, one that I can't seem to shake. As I sit here, writing this account of my experiences, I can't help but wonder what the future holds. Will I finally get the proof I need to convince others of what I've seen? Or will I become just another unexplained disappearance, another tragedy on our local highway of death?